4:00 p.m. And I call this meeting to order. Now we'll read the appeal statement. Pursuant to provisions of 2.68.030 of the Metropolitan Code of Laws, please take notice that decisions of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County Oversight Board may be appealed to the Chancery Court of Davidson County for review under common law writ of certiorari. Any appeal must be filed within 60 days after entry of a final decision by the board. Any person or other entity considering an appeal should consult with an attorney to ensure that time and procedural requirements are met. And I do see we do have a quorum. Next on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Are there any necessary corrections to the minutes? Is there a second? Second. It's been properly moved and second that we approve the minutes. Is there any focused discussion? All in favor of the motion to approve the minutes, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. The motion to approve the minutes is passed. Next on the agenda is the chair remarks. I am pleased that we are able to meet at the Community Oversight Board meeting today at East Park Community Center. Part of this board's mission is to listen and be a voice for the community. So I welcome the opportunity and look forward to more meetings in the community. Even though we continue to fill vacancies, our staff continues to meet a high volume of requests for services. The requested budget for 9 additional employees should enhance the management of the MNCO staff and provide them with needed tools to better serve the community. I look forward to our budget request being approved. Besides the MNCO budget, one of the board's concerns has been inconsistent investigative findings of MNPD's Office of Professional Accountability, and the Community Oversight Board, which currently results in a noticeable number of resolution rejections by the Chief of Police. A significant amount of time and energy is wasted going back and forth between the COB findings and MNPD's justification for rejection. This needs to change. As chair of the Community Oversight Board, I attended an April 4th Community Safety Advisory meeting. Apparently, the focus of this group is working with the strategic community organizations in an attempt to reduce violent crime. Also, I was a participant in the interviews with the community liaison for the community liaison position with Director Thrc this month. Lastly, Metro received an EEOC/THRC complaint by an employee of MNCO. Metro Legal filed a response on behalf of the COB, and I was asked to review the response prior to them sending it. The response was filed on April 25th. Because this is a pending legal matter, no further discussion is planned at this time, but I want to keep everyone informed. And that's the end of my report. Next on the agenda is the Executive Director's report. Director Thrc, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to give you a quick update on what's happening at the MNCO. So the office is open to the public Monday through Friday from 8 to 4:30. An investigator is always in the office. They rotate each week. So if a complainant comes in, they can talk to an investigator. And also complaints can be made online at Community Oversight Board Complaints at nashville.gov, as well as any public comments can be left at community@nashville.gov. Mr. Hayes, Chairperson Hayes, did assist me with the second round interviews for the MNCO Community Liaison position. And after careful consideration, an offer was made to the selected candidate who accepted and will start the journey with the MNCO in late May. We will also post a vacancy announcement for the MNCO Research 2 position in the next coming weeks, as well as we're going to fill the Assistant Director position. Hopefully we'll get all those positions filled before the end of this fiscal year, which is June 30th. And so I've attended multiple Metro trainings with our administrative assistant, Miss Marion Pinson, and today is Administrative Professionals Day, so I just want to thank her for the hard work she's doing. And so she's been working really hard on multiple trainings. And so as she gets acclimated to her position, she'll be continuing with Metro's just day-to-day functions. We met, the executive committee met on April the 14th, and we covered some things. We didn't have a quorum, so we weren't able to continue with the regular meeting. I've attended multiple trainings this month as well as the staff. So the staff attended Diversity Beyond the Obvious. That was hosted by the Nashville Conflict Resolution Center. It was facilitated by Nashville attorney Danielle Nellis. The investigators will attend a 4-week internal affairs certification program that starts tomorrow, and it's called Conducting Proper and Effective Investigations. And I also attended the Metro Human Resources Executive Leadership Training on yesterday. It was Building and Leading Effective Teams. Attorney Yoon will participate in the Movement Law Lab training, which is a think tank with emphasis in policy and strategy efforts. Our research analyst has attended multiple webinars as well. He's met, and myself, we met with Metro Internal Audit. We met with Deputy Chief Hagar, Captain Gilder, and Commander Laura, alongside Attorney Yoon and Research Analyst Williamson. We met with Attorney Alex Dickerson from the Metro Legal. Those discussions were in regards to the policy advisory report that you'll hear today. We also met with myself and Research Analyst Research Analyst Williamson met with Mr. Rice over civil technologies. And we also met with the Mayor's Office of Community Safety, Mike Lacey and Ron Johnson, and Stephen Martini, who is the Director of the Department of Communications. We've had some outreach this month. We met with, the public defender, Martisa Johnson, put together a panel discussion for Leadership Nashville's Criminal Justice Day, and myself, alongside other community leaders, Dr. Sekou Franklin, Jamel Campbell-Gooch, and Dr. Stephanie Kong, we spoke about the COB's history, police accountability, and Nashville community concerns. And I was also interviewed by a PhD candidate who attends the University of Maryland at College Park in regards to a research project on city-level police reform. The project is funded by the Russell Sage Foundation and run by professors at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the University of Maryland at College Park. And I also was included and asked to be a part of a roundtable discussion. Some oversight leaders from across the country contacted me to be a part of the NACO's 2022 annual conference for a roundtable discussion on building effective relationships. I will point out that Attorney Yoon, Chairperson Hayes, as well as Research Analyst Williamson, they also put in a proposal to be a part of the NACO conference, as well as Mr. Mark Wynn. And so we have 3 proposals out, and so I guess we'll get an answer pretty soon. The conference is in September, so I'm hoping that we'll get an answer pretty soon. So also NACO is looking for a host city for their 2023 conference. I just don't think that we have the time to be able to be included in that, but I think that it would be a great thing for our city to host that conference. next year, but not this year. I mean, well, in 2024. So anyway, we continue to try to have research outreach. It's going to be really good to have a community liaison to help with the outreach, because I've been doing it alone and with the help of, the other members of the team, but it's just been difficult to kind of meet with the community in the way that I think would be really impactful. I did meet with the criminal justice students from Tennessee State University. I shared information about the work of the COB, MNCO, and discussed building effective community relationships. At that time that I spoke with the students at TSU, one of the professors wanted to talk about having a internship and have students start maybe in the fall. And I told him that it's something that we would discuss and work through with our education committee. And I thought that it was really successful. They asked lots of questions. Research analyst Gavin Williamson has attended several webinars. He's done a lot of work in these last few weeks, had lots of meetings with the mayor's office, with Bruce Clark, talking about our performance management, our numbers. They want to, like, how we're going to work on certain, how we're going to work together collectively in regard to how we're going to report to the mayor, the things that they want. And so we are still working through that to figure out what the metrics look like for our department. The investigative team is making progress in clearing out the backlog of cases from previous years. They are moving forward. We are continuously getting complaints in regards to police misconduct. And so today, as I was very happy to hear that the mayor has approved at least 2 of the positions. So we will have 2 new investigators. I mean, that was funded for sure. I'm hopeful that some of the other positions will be funded as well. So we won't know that until later on this week. And so we've had a busy month. We've had 6 investor complaints since the last board meeting in March. We've received probably about 15 non-complaint contact calls for service. The investigators have submitted 11 requests for records. They haven't reported any issues with getting those records. The chief of police, Chief John Drake, responded to a letter that Chair Arnold Hayes sent. We got that response on April the 4th. In short, he says, you inquire whether any vehicle in Nashville was under suspicion and could have been stopped at the time of the complainant's vehicle was stopped. The answer is no, just the ones fitting the above facts. And for these reasons, I decline to reconsider my decision. And so if you all want to discuss that, you can. I think that was the decision that was left up to him, and that's the decision he made. Today, we're going to hear 3 proposed resolution reports. There is a Force Review Board meeting tomorrow, Thursday, April the 28th, that I've been invited to attend as a voting member. So I will be prepared and to go to that Force Review hearing tomorrow. So the justice integration systems, I have that on my report to tell you a little bit about that. So as I've been working in the last 2.5 years in this position, I've come to the understanding that Metro ITS doesn't really have the capacity to support any change for us. And so as we have been going to the NACO conferences, meeting with the different people there who offer technology support, we met a gentleman by the name of Tony Rice, who is the creator of a database and case management system called Civil Technologies. And I think I've mentioned it to you on multiple occasions. We have met with him on multiple occasions with his tech people or tech person. He's also sent the schematics. I think that it will be a platform that will be really helpful for us. It will ease the work that we're doing. It offers translation services as well. So what I did was after we met multiple times, I reached out to Metro ITS director, told him that I was interested in if he was able, did they think that they would be able to integrate civil technologies and import all of our data into that system. They did not think that they would be able to do that. And so I asked about the platform that we have in Nashville called JIS, which is Justice Integration Systems. Which is a system that I was accustomed to using in my other profession. But they are the support and the platform for all the courts, police department, sheriff's department, and all the other criminal justice agencies in this city. You have to be considered a criminal justice agency to be a part of that. That's what their bylaws state. So I reached out, they referred me to Judge Mondelli, who is the chairperson of the Justice Integration Systems. And so the committee is made up of all kind of criminal justice stakeholders in the city, as well as all of the general sessions court judges. And so, as well as the criminal court clerks and, the sheriff and a bunch of other people. And so he and I have been in communication in regards to that. He sent the bylaws for me to read to determine whether or not I want to accept the agreement. Attorney Yoon has been, on those emails as well. And so I think that it's something that I'm interested in for us as an agency to be considered a criminal justice agency and to be on that platform where I think that our information will stay secure. It is a system that is approved through CJIS and all of the other criminal justice talk that I'll talk about. But anyway, so that is something that is happening now. And once I get more information, I will share it with you. He said that it's a process to do that, but they want to move pretty quickly through it, but they've got to get the approval of all the other committee members as well. And then I have to read the bylaws and accept some certain agreements. And so I think that, and determine whether or not they're going to be able to integrate with civil. I think that they will be. I think that the other, for instance, a public defender built their interface and case management system from the ground up, and they were able to integrate with that, with JIS. And so I think it wouldn't be such a challenge for them to build up civil for us and have us on our own platform. So that's about that. Also, in thinking about, and this is moving on, when I thought about our office and the struggle that we have with getting community members in and out of our office space, as well as you all coming to the office to do the work that we have to do by looking at our casework, I realized that I needed to kind of just be proactive in trying to find parking for us. Since there isn't really any parking. The building has a parking lot, but all the slots seem to be occupied by residents of the building or tenants of the building. And so I reached out to a parking garage or group that is across the street, directly across the street, kind of perpendicular to where we are. And the gentleman was very kind. We worked through some processes, and what he said was that he would offer us validation for up to 3 hours at a flat rate for the department, which will be a $20 flat rate for anyone that comes to our office for those 3 hours. As a temporary fix, So, I mean, he had a lot of questions, how many times, but I think that we have worked it out. The office will pay for that and validate parking for community members, as well as for anyone who comes down, you all included. And so it's just a little bit down the street from where we're located. It's less than, it's 25 feet, 30, 40, 50 feet away. So that is very good news as a temporary fix. And as I was talking during the budget talks, I was talking to our the budget team from the mayor's office, and Ms. Kristen Wilson had talked about, I had expressed the issue with parking and how it was hard for our community members as well as board members to come to see us at our building. And so she suggested that I reach out, as well as our budget analyst had said the same thing, to reach out to Metro's public property person. So I contacted that person, Mr. Ron Coulter. I sent an email to him and asking him to put us on the list as they are looking for new properties in this city. Properties that I think, and as I mentioned, that would be more accessible for the community. It would offer anonymity and safety for them as well as MMPD personnel who want to come and file complaints. I think that one of the things is our office is pretty much in the center of a block. There's no parking, but it also isn't real discreet, for lack of a better term. So he said that, of course, there's a bunch of different departments that need to move around, and so we might get on the list, but we probably won't be at the top of the list. But I just wanted to make that known to him, that that was something that we're interested in. I did want to talk about a couple things in regards to an internship. So we did have a wonderful young woman who has sent her information in, who is interested in being an intern for our office for the summer. She is, and I'm very excited because as long as if we can compensate her the way that I think she needs to be compensated. She is looking to work with us for the summer. She attended Yale University. She's currently a senior project analyst working for the Council of State of Governments in New York. She's also been a program analyst, and she's also worked for the Bill de Blasio presidential campaign. And she's just been doing a host of things. I can give you more information about her afterwards, but I am interested in hiring her for the summer to work on policy as well as a community strategy outreach platform or project. So hopefully that would happen. And so if you want to have more information and know more information, I will introduce you to her. All right. And one other thing I think is of importance here. The DOJ's Community Relations Service Liaison reached out to get permission to refer the COB and the MNCO to communities that I guess that he deals with. I think it's the Southeast region he has. I think he covers Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And in those communities who've reached out to him and who are interested in creating community oversight boards, he wanted to know if we would approve, or if I would approve him sharing the information about this accountability board, how it was set up, and all of the history of the board, and use Nashville. He says that he uses Nashville as a model for best practices. So I thought that was great news for us. And that concludes my report. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them.
Thank you, Director Pritchard, for that detailed report. Are there any questions or comments for directors on the executive director's report? I know that there is. Okay, Mr. Goddard.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on one thing. It's not a question to Director Pritchard. Referring to, I guess it's the top of, what page am I on? Top of page 3. We've been back and forth with the chief over stopping of a vehicle with a very vague description. And the report that we were given had a very vague description in it. And I was quite critical of that, as were other board members, when we considered it, and very much believe that to be an error. I asked through our counsel, to take a look at the much more complete report that has confidential information that is submitted to the executive director. And I thought perhaps there was a OPA report. There was not in this case. That's highly confidential information. It is available to our staff. It's available to the board. It is not available to the general public. So I'm going to be a little circumspect in my discussion of it. But that, I wanted to see what the chief had, the OPA question is whether the chief had information other than what we have had. What I read in that report was a lot of confidential information. Specific information with the type and description of the vehicle was not available to the officers that made the decision to stop. So they didn't know it was different than what some other officers knew. More importantly, there was a lot of highly confidential information about location and other things that did much better than was in what we had seen describe why the officers had concern about a specific vehicle. After I read it, I don't have an ability to question the chief's decision. Y'all might any of you might come to different conclusions reading that. But given the comments I made earlier publicly about that, I wanted to say that. I also am going to try to read most of those reports we have on PRRs. I've done those for the reports coming today. And if there are force review reports or OPA reports that have been issued with respect to PRRs that are coming to us, hope that I can read those. Those are available to each of you if you want to read them as well. It takes time to do that, but they're information we can have. To be really clear though, Daniel, weigh in if you need to on top of me. We can read them. We can't talk about them other than in these meetings to each other. We can ask you questions, and Jill, we certainly can't forward them and discuss them with others beyond the board and board staff. Thank you. I apologize for the length of that.
Okay, and I do want to say something. We're set up a little bit different, so you may have to raise your hands. I may not be able to see everyone turning their name tags, but I believe Mr. Milliner was next. And then, Dr. Hildreth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two things on the Executive Director's report. Number one, just wanted to confirm that Civil indicated that it would have no problem integrating with JIS.
Yeah, we don't know that for sure yet. So he sent the schematics, and I am going to produce those to the JIS technology team once we get the approval. Okay. If we can, I still think that being on the JIS platform is the best route for us.
All right, thank you. Secondly, Mr. Chair, in relationship to the response from MNPD to your letter that was written in regards to the PRR, we have to go with the information that we have available to us. And I've read every PRR, I've read every background report associated with it that has been a part of the public record and been distributed to us. And I have to, Mr. Goddard, say that I have to rely upon the description of the vehicle as it was presented to me in the PRR. Now, it sounds like you may have learned something above and beyond that, but a gray sedan does not a black Jeep make, if I was reading it correctly. And so therefore, the reasonableness of the stop, based upon a previous interaction that encountered individuals who were in that type of vehicle, a gray sedan, does not seem, as per the MNPD response, to show reasonableness in maybe the next day stopping a black Jeep. So I was just relying upon the information that's been presented to me, and if there is additional information that you could share, I'd really appreciate that. Otherwise, I'll just leave my comments for the record.
If you don't mind, Chair,
I'd like to ask Dr. Hildreth, is it okay for me to recognize Mr. Goddard? Okay, Mr. Goddard, go next.
I wasn't clear. What we did before, I agreed with and participated in. I have no criticism of that. I have no criticism of the staff report as they presented it. They could not include that confidential information. Having had further concerns about that with the chief, having read that, I simply wanted to raise, with respect to what I voted before, that having read what I've read, I come to a different conclusion and encourage other board members too. That was my point, not to criticize staff or other board members.
Understood.
And I apologize, I'm hesitant to be any more specific because of the confidentiality concerns as I understand them and as Daniel has cautioned me. I'm sorry, Mr. Union has cautioned me.
Okay, Dr. Hildreth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Executive Director Fitchard, thank you for that excellent and detailed and comprehensive report. You covered a lot of points, and one of the things I want to do is acknowledge the public who is in the room. Thank you for being here. We haven't seen this many people since our beginning, and if, Mr. Chair, if I can take a point of personal privilege. Well, yeah, first of all, you too. Along with Member Holloway, who is not present, we are the only two that were here from the very beginning. And so it means everything for you to be in this room. In addition to all of you who are watching us either live or on the tape, we applaud you. And so there's a couple of things that I want to lift from the report to make some connections that you heard, because I want to make sure that everybody is truly in this conversation so you can be participatory, right? Executive Director Fitchard, you mentioned with respect to the budget, and budgeting is a very important process. We pay for what we value, right? One of the things that happens in public budgets is that the group that you meet with in government ask for metrics, measures, indicators, right? And I think I heard you say that we want to make sure we're reporting what the mayor's office wants. I wanted to encourage us to make sure that we are capturing, counting, and reporting what matters to us as well. To your members who are doing the work, to the board members who are trying to interpret what they're hearing and you're watching us interpret, and also to you. Because the question to all of us taxpayers who are paying for every bit of this is, how do you know you're getting your money's worth? How do you know that we're doing, all of us, are doing what you voted us to do and what we paid to do. So when we're looking at measures, we can talk about how many complaints we had. We can talk about how many PRRs, proposed resolution reports. You're going to hear 3 of them. But maybe one of the measures, and we talked about this in the executive committee meeting, maybe one of the measures is how often does the police chief accept our recommendation when we recommend he do something than the police department did the first time, right? Because if we do 10 reports and you love what we said on all 10 reports and we get 9 no's back, maybe that's something you want to measure. So I wanted to highlight that so that we're all thinking about and can report to the chair what other measures we want to make sure are being included, and y'all are included in that too. Get that information to us. You can always go directly to Director Fitcher to ask her. That was one thing. The second, so you heard us talking about parking and access to that office. Y'all, that was related to this very important conversation that Board Member Milner and Board Member Goddard just had. Because today we're going to hear 3 PRRs. All 3 of those are on the website. When you go on the website, and I complain, it's hard to find them, but you look over on the left and you go down, there's PRRs, you can click on it, there's a database, and it comes up, and there's a description. Officer 1, Officer 2, did this, that, and the other. That's all we can talk about in public, and you get to look that up before we start talking. As a matter of fact, take out your phones now if you haven't read them. You can follow along. But wait, there's more. There's information that's available in the staff office that we board members are permitted to read, right? Mm-hmm. And if we do our homework in advance, then we're permitted to make our vote based on what's in that file. We can't share it with y'all, okay? Those are the rules. It's hard to get down to that office. We all have jobs. None of the board members get paid to do this. So I don't know about anybody else, but I got a day job too. We have to take off from our job, go downtown just like you do, try to find parking, pay for parking to read that special file. If I'm going to be perfectly honest, sometimes all I can do is read the PRR that's posted that you all have, right? But then you see what happens? What if there's something in the PRR and it's vague, but there's a detail and we can't do the work because we don't have access? Access to every single part of this process is important for all of us. And you can't always have the access we have, but we all need the maximum access allowed by law to do the best job we can for you. So I hope you don't mind that little explainer, because I hope that makes it possible for every single person to say, hey, wait a minute, parking's important because it's actually related to justice. Okay, so thank you very much for that, and keep doing what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. Director Fitcher.
I did want to say that as for the parking, and I appreciate that, I do. We have been working really hard to get you guys a shared file drive as well. Attorney Yoon has been working on that. I reached out to Alex Dickerson. He said that the MOU agreement that we would have between Metro Legal and you all is in the works. The issue is when they wrote it, they didn't include the technological stuff. So they didn't know the technical language, so they sent it over to Metro ITS to include the technical language that needed to be able to move forward on an MOU. So that's another part that's in the works too. I don't know how long. He didn't have a deadline on when that would happen, but that would be something that would be also, I think, really helpful for this process. So I just wanted to give you an update on that.
Okay. Ms. McCray.
Thank you, Chair. Director Fitchard, I know at our last meeting, we were still looking for a community outreach liaison. Have we moved along in the process, or is it still posted?
No, as I mentioned earlier, we've hired someone.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, so she will start at the end of May. Yeah, I didn't want to introduce her yet because she's still working and she wanted to kind of wait till she puts her, her 2 weeks in. So, but she will start at the end of, I think, May the 23rd. And so at that point, I will make certain that you get the information on her. She'll be a wonderful addition to the work that we're doing.
Okay, thank you for your report. If no other questions or comments, next item on the agenda is the Policy Advisory Report. Mr. Crowell Williamson, you have the floor.
Have we tested this? Yes, we have. Great, it's working. All right, hi everybody. I am probably going to be talking at you for a little while, so I apologize in advance for that, but there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions about anything. I imagine this will be a robust discussion, and I look forward to it. So I'm reiterating a report that I brought to you all last month, a policy advisory report about syntactical differences that we found between MNPD's investigative findings and the COB's. Since I don't have the ability to present a PowerPoint, I did provide you all with a printed copy, so feel free to follow along on that, as I'm going to reference what's on those slides a fair amount. During a review of Chief Drake's responses to a recent resolution report issued by the board, we noticed that there were different investigative findings from MNPD as compared to the COB. You can look at that chart that I provided and see that, for instance, in the exoneration category, the policy exoneration category in the COB side versus the exonerated or the policy/training failure on the MNPD side, those are fairly different definitions. They have sort of the same core, but they could be interpreted differently, and that was enough to kind of raise flag and cause a little bit of concern. This is ultimately a report about administrative language, which is not the most exciting topic, but it is an important topic. For instance, the Department of Justice, in reviewing San Francisco Police Department, they noted that San Francisco's oversight body and SFPD's Internal Affairs Office had different definitions, which they recommended that they rectify as quickly as possible. And they flagged this as an issue because, and I'm quoting here, although this is a subtle difference, administrative process language is important because there's legal precedence to how standards are applied, and different definitions can have significant impact on the process. In addition, the different categories for findings create challenges for ensuring accuracy and sufficiency of the disciplinary record. Also, these differences add to the challenge of identifying and addressing institutional issues, such as that of training or policy. So with that in mind, we developed a couple of research questions. Firstly, how do the COB's policies relative to MNPD's compare to other oversight bodies relative to their respective police departments? Second, is the discrepancy between the COB's investigative findings and MNPD's significant enough to warrant concern? And third, are there any potential negative repercussions of failing to address this discrepancy? So to answer that question, MNCO staff compared the policies of several peer oversight agencies, namely Atlanta, Cincinnati, Cleveland, San Francisco, and Seattle, to their respective police departments. And we chose those cities because they have investigative oversight bodies comparable to the COB and because they have relatively similar population size. The results are rather in-depth, so I'll just kind of give a 30,000-foot view of them. 4 of the 5 cities, namely Cleveland, Cincinnati, San Francisco, and Seattle, had nearly identical policies or identical policies between their police and their oversight bodies. The 5th, Atlanta, had significant differences in the policies between Atlanta Citizens Review Board and the Atlanta Police. Also of note, and I'll get more into this later, is that Atlanta is the only one of those cities not recently under some form of federal agreement with the Department of Justice, whether that be a consent decree or otherwise. And Atlanta has flagged this as a difference. They've kind of been yelling about this for the better part of a decade, as they outlined in their annual report. And I think this really highlights the importance of this report. No other measure determines the public's perception of police accountability than the department's response to citizen allegations of police misconduct. The disciplinary percentage of agreement on sustained complaints for many citizens is the most critical factor of how well the law enforcement department are attempting to hold their officers accountable. This percentage is also the citizens' measuring stick about the effectiveness of the oversight body and the police department's respect for the agency's work. And Atlanta historically has really struggled with having their police chief accept the findings of their complaints. You'll see on that graph, I believe it's on slide 7, they have an internal goal of 75% agreement, and they've never really even approximated that goal aside from once in 2012. Generally, the police accepts detained complaints somewhere in the range of 11% to 31%, which they deem as an unacceptable number. And I brought to you last month, and again this month, as well as an appendix on this report, monthly chief response tracking so that we can begin to track these same numbers. There have been no responses from Chief Drake regarding resolution reports between last month and this month, so all the numbers are the same. And so thus the argument remains the same, which is that MNPD has agreed with 66% of the findings overall that we have issued, but that number is really boosted by acceptance of findings of not sustained or exonerated or something like that. When you only consider findings of sustained or deficiencies identified, AKA when we find evidence of misconduct or something along those lines, MNPD only agrees with 6.2% of the board's findings, which is obviously a very low number, though I would caution against reading into it too much since it's a pretty small sample size right now. That number could change very drastically. However, it is low enough that I felt it prudent to flag and also felt it prudent to produce this report. And as I mentioned earlier, Atlanta is the only one of the studied cities not under some form of federal agreement with the DOJ, and also it's the only city without comparable findings to its police department. While the coherence of investigative findings was never really the focal point of these consent decrees or these federal investigations, the other 4 departments made explicit mention that there should be coherence in the investigative findings of oversight and police bodies. And as you can see, there is currently a low level of agreement on findings of sustained misconduct here in Nashville. And as I said, I don't think it's currently an issue, but we are hoping to take proactive steps to prevent it from becoming one, and having coherence in investigative findings is one such route to ensure that accountability. So now, moving on to the proposed recommendations of the report. There are 4, and you'll note that they are, these are a different set of recommendations than I made a month ago, and I'll kind of get into the reasoning why. But compared to last month's, I took out the second recommendation, and then I broke the...
Mr. Williamson, what page is that on?
It is slide 10 for me, so I imagine page 5 for you. It's in a kind of a blue box.
Page 5.
Great. So yeah, I took away what was the second recommendation and then split what was the third recommendation into 3 recommendations, as well as making some language modifications in them. So there are now 4 recommendations where there were 3, but it's largely the same content. So the first recommendation is that the COB and MNPD should meet and develop a shared set of definitions for investigative findings. They should work to develop such standards within 60 days of the issuance of this report, and I recommended referencing the investigative findings of Chicago for an example. Secondly, COB and MNPD should modify Section 9B of their MOU to require that the MNPD operate under a presumption of correctness regarding the board's investigative findings. Thirdly, COB and MNPD should agree to modify Section 9B of the MOU to require MNPD meet a standard of preponderance of the evidence when it disagrees with the findings of the board. Finally, fourth, the COB and MNPD should agree to modify Section 9B of the MOU to include language outlining that, absent preponderance of the evidence that the board's findings are in error, MNPD should implement the recommended discipline from the board. As a point of comparison, I pulled up what Section 9B of our MOU currently states, and as it reads right now, upon receipt of a resolution report, the Chief of Police agrees to review and provide a written response thereto within 45 calendar days. Such response should include, but not be limited to, acceptance, partial acceptance, or non-acceptance of the findings and/or recommendations, a statement of reasons for the department's decision, and a description of actions taken by the department in response to the report. As that is currently written, really all that the Chief of Police is obliged to do is provide us a response within 45 days. The rest of the language uses words like shall, which offers some sort of ambiguity as to what exactly the chief is obliged to do. So that kind of is the impetus for strengthening this a little bit. And these modifications that I'm proposing, especially recommendations 2 through 4, draw largely from issue 24, which is charter language that was approved by Cleveland voters in November of 2021. On slide 12, I provided the full text there, and I've kind of bolded the highlights that I'll go over now, which are basically that the chief must presume the findings of the board to be correct and defer to the board's fact findings and recommendations without absent affirmative proof by clear and convincing evidence that the findings are erroneous. If they can't find that proof, the chief must impose at least the minimum discipline that the board has recommended. And the only way to rebut that is by having clear and convincing evidence, essentially, is what that portion says. It is important to note that this was challenged in court. After the charter amendment's passage, the city of Cleveland filed a motion asking a federal district court to reconcile the provisions of the amendment with the consent decree. And the judge, who has overseen the city's consent decree since 2015, heard that and said he believed that the issue presented no impediment to the city's consent decree with the DOJ. While he did not formally approve an agreement between the DOJ and the city, his sort of acceptance did afford Cleveland's mayor the opportunity to begin appointing members of this newly established police commission, which has the aforementioned duties. And this is not going to be in the slides I gave you. It's a separate handout. I kind of did this at the 11th hour, so my apologies, but I just wanted to go over what I'm talking about when I say presumption of correctness, because I think that that is the stickiest point of this whole report. Definitionally, a presumption of correctness is a rule of law by which the finding of fact or ruling of law is presumed true, subject to the presentation of other findings that may rebut the presumption. I'm pulling from case law here now, so it's going to be a little dry, but quoting here, it's also notable that the presumption of correctness is a starting point, but it's only a presumption and it may be overcome. In the instance of trial courts ultimately must exercise their own independent judgment, and that court is free to substitute its own findings after first giving due respect to the agency's findings. So an example of that is that state court factual findings are presumed correct, and petitioners have the burden of rebutting the presumption of correctness by clear and convincing evidence. There's also legislation, or case law rather, that discusses how the findings of a board where formal hearings are held should and do come before courts with a strong presumption in their favor, primarily on the presumption that the official duty is regularly performed. Considerable weight should be given to findings of experienced administrative bodies after a full and formal hearing, especially in cases involving technical or scientific evidence. And then I just pulled Cleveland's presumption of correctness again. I already went over that, so I don't need to do it again. But really, I think what we're talking about here is whether we are going to pass things that will allow the COB to be on sort of the cutting edge of what other oversight bodies are doing. This is not yet a national precedent, but other oversight bodies are doing it, and it is withstanding challenges in court, so I think it begs consideration of whether we want to do those things as well. In response to discussion that we had at last meeting, I've myself, Legal Advisor Yoon, and Director Fitchard have had several meetings, both independently and together. We've met with Metro Legal, we met with MNPD, we've had conversations with the Nashville Bar Association, the Sycamore Institute, and I spoke with Ryan Walker, who's the Senior Policy Analyst with the Cleveland Community Police Commission. So he was very in tune and helpful in getting me acclimated to issue 24 and how that all sorted out. So there are, as I mentioned, several changes from the last document you received. On the 14th, Director Fitchard, Legal Advisor Yoon, and I met with Deputy Chief Hagar, Captain Gilder, and Commander Lara at our office. And then a week later, the three of us met with Alex Dickerson, the Assistant Metropolitan Attorney at Metro Legal. So now I'm going to kind of go recommendation by recommendation in terms of the feedback that they brought us. And you can weigh the recommendations that MNCO has made kind of side by side with what MNPD and what Metro Legal thinks, so as to have the fullest picture possible here. The first recommendation, that we should develop a shared set of definitions. MNPD heard us on that one, and they sort of thought that the easiest solution would be for us to adopt their investigative findings. They had a number of reasons for this related to historical data and a number of other things I'm happy to get into if folks are interested, but our sort of concern or our pushback with that is that while MNPD does have a clear burden of proof when it relates to investigative findings, it's sort of hard to find in their policy manual where exactly that's referenced. For instance, the section that I pulled all those definitions from, the burden of proof is nowhere to be found in that section. It is in other sections of the report, I want to be clear about that, but their burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence, and it's not abundantly clear to a community member, to somebody who's kind of casually observing, that they do have that legal burden. So they agreed on that point to add sort of a section, maybe a paragraph or a sentence immediately prior to all those definitions that would clearly outline that their burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence. That was the concession that they were willing to make on that one. Metro Legal had no issues with that first recommendation. So yeah, consider MNPD's thoughts as we move forward. As I mentioned, there was a previous recommendation that recommended that the COB and MNPD should strive to reach a 75% acceptance rate on all findings issued by the board. We removed that as a formal recommendation and put it into the discussion section after our conversations with MNPD and Metro Legal. We just felt that it wasn't quite tangible enough as it relates to a policy change. It was more of an aspirational goal, and so we integrated that into the discussion section rather than having it be a recommendation. So we thank Metro Legal and MNPD for their thoughts on that. The current second recommendation, I think, is where there's the most stickiness, as I mentioned earlier. This is that we should operate under a presumption of the chief should operate under a presumption of correctness regarding the board's investigative findings. Both MNPD and Metro Legal's concern here is that this improperly delegates appointing authority powers and decisions in disciplinary matters to the COB, which calls into question the impartiality of MNPD decisions in disciplinary cases. So as I mentioned, we had a meeting with Metro Legal, and they were sort of clear that this recommendation, as it is written, would not fit in with civil service laws as they are currently written. So to rectify that, we could kind of go one of three routes. We could seek to amend civil service rules. That has been done, and historically, civil service rules have not really been modified so as to effectively integrate our department, so this might be a good thing for us to consider anyways. Two, we could do some sort of council action, we could get legislation passed that way, or three, we could have some sort of ballot referendum, as did Cleveland when they were passing this. But as it's currently written, this is not something that Metro Legal is going to co-sign, so if we were to send the report as it is to MNPD, I imagine that would be their position as well. I recognize that those options that I presented to you are weighty. They involve a lot of political considerations, and they also involve a lot of considerations when it comes to the staff's time and the board's time. But I wanted to present them to you as options so that you as the board can discuss and decide what you view best. The third recommendation, MNPD sort of punted that one to Metro Legal and said whatever their opinion is, that's our opinion. And Metro Legal did not have an issue with that one. The fourth recommendation, there's a minor clerical change that Metro Legal recommended that we make. Basically, their concern is that if the way this is currently written, if MNPD has already issued a decision concerning discipline when the COB releases its own findings, MNPD cannot revise its decision simply because the COB issued a different recommendation. We've kind of gotten to this conversation before with Chief Drake. This is when he's responded and said MNPD cannot legally impose these things. That's what he was talking about. If MNPD has already recommended a written reprimand for an officer on one charge, and then we try to recommend a 10-day suspension on that same charge, that's not something we can do. And there is a little bit of room for interpreting it that way, given the way recommendation 4 is written right now. So I think, and I do defer to our legal advice here, but I think a clause added in there that just says something like, absent preponderance of the evidence that the board's findings are in error, MNPD should implement the recommended discipline from the board, absent exigent circumstances such as MNPD already ruling a finding on that same allegation. We do have to be careful with our language there, but that is sort of the consideration we would have to make. And that is sort of all in terms of the actual report. I did want to give you sort of a high-level overview as well of what the board process looks like now. What our rules say is that the director, upon review and approval of the research proposal, shall present it to the board and request approval to proceed on either an expedited or regular schedule. If the director determines that the board's consideration of an anticipated draft policy report should be expedited, the director should advise and seek permission from the executive committee for such a review. That already occurred at our March executive committee, so as it stands, we are currently permitted to move forward with this on an expedited review. Expedited review makes it sound like we're going to go through this more quickly. The timeline is actually the same. It just kind of changes when we can have meetings about this, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Before the board votes to adopt the draft policy advisory report, the proposed action must be noticed on the agenda and considered at no fewer than 2 board meetings on different days. At the first meeting, that's tonight, MNCO will present and explain the draft report, how it was developed, and key issues for board consideration. The board may discuss, but not vote to adopt the proposed report at that first meeting. Unless the draft is withdrawn by the director at or before that board meeting, it shall proceed, and the chair will appoint a one-person board committee to solicit public comment and conduct a public forum with the director to receive community input on the draft. And one of the reasons I broke that recommendation into 3 recommendations is that the board may consider the report and recommendations collectively or separately, and the board can consider recommendations individually and choose which of them to approve. So as it stands, we are on an expedited report approval process, which means that tonight, the board's obligation is to vote on whether or not you want to release a draft for public comment. And then at the next board meeting, or rather at the date of the next board meeting, there can be a public hearing and an evaluation by the board whether or not to issue the revised report on that same day. If we revert this to a regular report approval process, that public forum must occur sometime between tonight and our next board meeting. It cannot occur on the same day as that board meeting. So that does introduce some more logistical challenges and another meeting to everyone's schedule. So if we stick to the expedited report schedule, we can, as we have with the soft empty hand report, have a separate hour or however long we determine we need where we solicit public comment, and that is the only item on the agenda. And then we go into our regular board meeting thereafter where the board can vote on whether or not to issue the revised report. And I think that is all that I have. It was a lot. I thank you all for indulging me, but it's a complicated topic and I want to make sure that we are all informed. So if anyone has feedback, questions, comments, I welcome it.
Thank you, Mr. Crown-Williamson, for that detail, and you did a good job going through that detail. Now, are there any questions or comments on the policy advisory report? Mr. Nguyen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations. And please accept my apology for missing the last 2 meetings. I read through the report, and it seemed to me, and it was a thorough report on the 4 cities. It seemed to me the language, the common language between the oversight boards and the police department was similar after a DOJ finding. Does that sound correct? And the language of preponderance of evidence, which is a measure of civil law, not criminal law. I've never seen it before in this context before. So did the legal department in Metro have an objection to having a common language of preponderance of evidence with the police department like in these other cities, or were they okay with that?
Well, they already have that common standard. It is written into MNPD's policy that the burden of proof for discipline is the preponderance of the evidence. They just don't have that as it's currently written adjacent to all these definitions that we just discussed. So I imagine they don't have an issue with it since it's already policy, but we can have further discussion on that.
So they're practicing it, but they haven't written it down.
They have written it down. They just haven't written it down in a place that someone who's not very ingrained with police policy and is not familiar with a 1,200-page manual may not be attuned to. And I want to be clear that I think that everyone in MNPD is under the assumption that, and knows well that they are all operating under the presumption of correctness. Right. This is more of a concern of whether community members are able to recognize that, and we want to just make that very, very clear that we're all operating on the same definitions.
Okay. So, and just a couple quick ones, this will be quick. I noticed I think it was Cincinnati, Atlanta, they've got a category for supervision failure. We've had this conversation before on this board about different kinds of standards for punishment of supervisors versus ranking officers or patrol officers. I think this is a good idea, but I didn't see anywhere else other than Atlanta. Is that what you found? And why did they put it in their category in Atlanta?
It's also in San Francisco.
It's in San Francisco as well?
Yeah, I don't have a solid reason for why some departments do and some departments don't have a supervision failure. Right. But I would sort of echo your point that is something that we have discussed previously as a board, and it might be something worthwhile for us to consider. I haven't read anything specific to why some departments have it and some don't. Okay, and
the last thing is, I noticed in San Francisco, they use the Collaborative Reform Initiative to do their white paper, basically on their problems. Correct. With the connection between their oversight and police. So they had that was DOJ, that was an outside entity that came in and sort of mediated between the police and the board.
That's right.
Is that an option for us here? Is that something, because I've got a suggestion, I just want to ask if that was, because you're saying they're not going to accept these 4 recommendations, not all of them, right?
I believe not, especially not the second one.
Okay.
And to answer your question, I can't recall if it was San Francisco who did this or another department, but any department can reach out to the Department of Justice and request sort of an audit of itself.
Right.
So that's not something that the board has the power to compel, to my knowledge, but MMPT could ask the Department of Justice to do something akin to what San Francisco did.
Well, not as a representative of the board, but I have to disclose, I work for the Collaborative Reform Initiative. That were my employers. So out of curiosity, I asked them today what that process would look like. And they said that the report that was conducted on San Francisco was more of a diagnostic. Early on when the Collaborative Reform Initiative was created, and originally DOJ, it's transformed to a different kind of process now. But they did say that they requested the police department. They could request consultants to come and look at the connection between the language at the COB and the police department. It's only a matter of the chief asking for the CRITAC is what it's called now, the Collaborative Reform Initiative Technical Assistance Center, as a request at no charge whatsoever if they want someone to negotiate between, that's my word, not theirs, between the police and the board. So I thought I would just mention that to you. Obviously, you know that it can be requested by the police. If there's a concern about having someone come in and take a look at, because that's exactly what they did in San Francisco.
Well, that's a very interesting suggestion. Thank you for bringing my attention to that.
It's a good report too, by the way. Did a great job on it.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Okay, anyone else? Oh, Judge Brown, I believe was next.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm having a good bit of difficulty hearing you again. You stick with the mask, and this room makes me hard to hear. Is there some way we can get the written comments of Metro and see what they are? I have no problem whatever with trying to see if we can get common definitions between the various things. I think that would be very helpful to all parties. Where I'm having some real heartburn is over the presumption of correctness. I mean, you've given us the sheet here with these cases, but those cases all involve where there's been a formal hearing. There's been presentation by both sides, the officers have been heard. There's been a formal hearing when the board makes, or the equivalent of a jury, the court makes findings. Unfortunately, as we've talked about earlier tonight, we have real trouble getting into the details of the reports. There's no presentation of the formal presentation of the officer's case. There's no formal presentation of the complainant's case, and we vote on those, and yet we're arguing that somehow that has suddenly gotten a presumption of correctness. But all these cases, if you read them, all were after formal hearings. We don't have a formal hearing. And I've gotten burned on a couple of these where I voted for them, and then when I've read the chief's response, it's kind of like Paul Harvey. I'm getting the rest of the story. And I'm very uncomfortable with trying to push for presumption of correctness unless we have a much more formal proceedings, a much more formal way of weighing the evidence to justify a presumption of correctness. What we have now just doesn't, unfortunately, in my view, justify a presumption of correctness. We just don't have a way to have all of the information that we would need to do to be sure we're correct.
Well, I'd like to say something in response to that, Judge Brown. I think that when we talk about the presumption of correctness, I think that investigators are putting as much information as they can in the investigative report. I think it is up to the boards, it's their duty and responsibility to come to the office, to look at the reports, and then weigh the evidence that is in our system. Everything that's in those reports, even if it's not included in the report, the evidence is captured and it's preserved and it is on our case management system. You've come to the office and you've seen it. And so just because the chief of police says that the information is the way that he has made the decision, he doesn't want to move forward on the discipline, doesn't mean that the report is not correct. And so I beg to differ with you on that.
Well, I'm not necessarily criticizing the staff as such. I'm just saying, for me to make a decision, I need to hear more evidence to feel like my decision is entitled to a presumption of correctness. Again, these presumption of correctness for this legal issue in civil cases, that's after an adversary hearing. I mean, we don't hear from the police officer that we were recommending disciplinary action against. They make a statement to the investigator, but again, it's not a situation where if I'm going to rule on something, I want to hear from both sides specifically. And so that's why I have a real heartburn with the presumption of correctness as such.
I hear your concerns, and that's why I broke that recommendation into 3 so that board members can sort of evaluate each part as they see fit. But to answer another part of your question, can we provide you with Metro Legal's opinion on these? Some of it we have written in email and some of it we don't, but I'll defer to Legal Advisor Yoon as to whether we're allowed to disseminate that.
We're allowed to. You're board members, you get everything that the staff gets. I will say that we got their written response to an earlier draft, so I would feel more comfortable once we know sort of where this lands, we can get an updated version with the new recommendations. I mean, if you want, yes, I will just say that. I'll also update on the Sharepoint that we've been discussing ongoing. I gave you an update last time that we should have this in the next couple of weeks, and I apologize that wasn't done, but that was the information I got. On March 15th, I got an email from Metro Legal saying that ITS should have us something in 2 weeks, which would have been the end of March. So I was very hopeful that we would have it by this meeting. So obviously that hasn't been done. I think it's worth considering. Obviously the same issue of getting downtown and finding parking and paying notwithstanding. Other options that we've sort of taken off the table because we thought that the shared drive would be available, maybe we revisit those, such as we personally bring you this information on a USB drive, or we email you knowing that there are security concerns with people using their individual email addresses. This work is important. The information that you want to get, that you've been earnestly asking for ever since the beginning, we want to get that to you. And I think that security concerns notwithstanding, it's worth it to maybe risk that in order to get you the information that you need before these meetings.
And I think one of the things that happens here, if we're just talking about the work that we're doing in general, is the fact that we are conducting administrative investigations. The sensitive information that we receive from the police department may have information that is while they're working on a criminal investigation. All right. And so we don't want to muddy those things. But as you're looking at the information, we are looking at the preponderance of evidence. We are not looking at reasonable doubt. And sometimes that can kind of overlap in the information that you have. And so I think it's important that even if you get this information, you know how to put it in context, know what you're looking for, where the misconduct, how it applies, because sometimes you're looking at stuff and then you may wander off into whether somebody's innocent or guilty and all of these things that has nothing to do with the administrative process. And so I think, you can go ahead and finish.
Anyone else? Ms. McCree, I believe. And then Mr. Goddard.
Thank you, Chair. Gavin, thank you for this great report. My question is in regards to recommendation number 2. You have given us 3 options, heavy options, on how to move forward with this or possibilities to move forward. In your professional opinion, what would be the path of least resistance?
You've asked me another heavy question, so that, I don't know that I'm prepared to answer that on the spot, but what I will say is that I think that the way that Cleveland found the way to do it with the least resistance was to put it as a ballot initiative, because that only requires the will of the people. It doesn't require council approval or civil service approval. But I will also add that internally, staff have been having conversations about whether we need to be thinking about civil service rules more broadly and how we fit into that conversation. So this might be sort of the door opening into that, but that's not my recommendation per se. That's just an option based on the information that I have.
I will say this about civil service. I mean, we've been doing this for 3 years, going on 4. And at no time, and this is a conversation I had with Mr. Dickerson from Metro Legal. As we're going through this process, I don't think that there's ever been a real discussion about the civil service making pathway for us. I mean, they knew that this was going to be a problem. If they could anticipate that it would be a problem, but at some point, civil service has never made a pathway for this process for us. And so I think there is some validity in reaching out to them, sitting down with them. I think that that was an option that he mentioned to us, because I think it's important that as we're going through this process, that we think about all of the police force is civil servants. And as we are issuing discipline recommendations, how do we do this in a way that's respectful to the process, but also considers their due process rights as well? And so I do think there should be some conversation with it's a process because they're a board as well. But I do think there is some merit in reaching out to the Civil Service Commission.
The only other thing I'd add to that is that we did have as part of our conversation with Alex Dickerson, he did kind of generally provide us with what that process would look like. So we can definitely disseminate that information to the board if desired.
Mr. Carter.
Here. Thank you. A few things. Take me a moment. One thing I wanted to notice, on the syntactical differences, Metro Police, if I understand it, had one option of a policy training failure. And I view that as something, I may be misunderstanding, where if they find there wasn't policy violated, but they didn't like the result, it needs to be trained differently, have officers behave differently. I would hope they could add that, whether it's part of the formal agreement and language with our board and staff, or something off to the side, that if they identify something that requires additional and particularly different or corrective training, they still have the ability to flag that in the resolution process where we've had complaints, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that already is part of their policy, though.
Okay.
I believe it was Captain Gilder mentioned that they don't use it a ton, but it is part of their policy.
Yeah. I would note that the charter amendment that created this board and gives all of its authority it says that discipline has to be given within the parameters of civil service rules and regulations. So that's a given. If the Metro Legal has concern, we've got concern about those rules, we've got to operate within them or get them changed. I appreciate the simplest, shortest distance between 2 points is a voter referendum. I would really like to try reaching out and seeing if we can't reach agreement first to get, we probably need Metro Legal and the Civil Service Commission or Executive Director, I don't even know how the thing works, in the same room and see if we can't lay out our concerns and their concerns and see what we can find that Metro Legal can pass on as constitutional, doesn't deprive due process, that they might be receptive to. I would suggest that. That doesn't preclude having a voter referendum if that doesn't work, but I would have that as a way to start. Let me address a broader concern briefly, and that is what we're prioritizing for PARs, and I appreciate a lot of this goes back to your predecessor. That's not you, Mr. Williamson. I believe right now, as much, just as an example, as much concern has been expressed by board members and by this community and by a number of members of Metro Council that license plate readers and how they are going to be implemented and what policies Metro Police has for that, how they can be used, how the data can be used, how the data cannot be used is vitally important and time sensitive right now. We've heard from Commander Lara that Metro Police are open to working with this board staff and developing those. I would very much hope, and if the staff would be helpful to staff to have this board's endorsement of that, I'll make a motion later, not at this point, to strongly encourage starting the process towards a PAR or whatever the appropriate document is, to work with Metro and be working on license plate reader policies and regulations and doing the vital research to determine what's best practices, what has and hasn't worked in other police departments with COB oversight where these have been implemented. I would place that ahead of some of what we're doing here, or certainly as we think about other possibilities going forward, put that way to the front, if that's a possibility. Thank you.
The only response that I would have to that is I agree with you about the importance of license plate readers. What we don't know at this moment is whether we're going to have a staff member who's capable of reviewing license plate reader data or anything like that. We will know that on Friday, or at least we'll have a good idea on Friday. So in the month ahead, I think this is an important conversation to be having. But up until now, it's been sort of unclear as to what level of data access we will have and other such considerations.
Well, we may be talking across purposes. I'm talking about looking at what policies are in place elsewhere and what type of thing we would have in policies. We will need license plate reader data and this or that down the road, but starting a conversation with Metro now to find out who their key point person is to develop their rules and regs. We've heard from Commander Lara, and if I'm misremembering, Commander, please let me know, but that there will be someone appointed, there will be policies prepared and adopted before license plate readers are implemented. He's nodding yes, and start that process now. I do not want us to get behind. Personally, I do not want us to get behind on that. If that means some of your time has to be spent on that or other staff before we get that additional person, I would strongly suggest that needs to happen.
I guess the question would be to have Commander Lara come up and talk to us about whether or not MMPD has even thought about moving forward on that policy work regarding license plate readers. I will say that at the Metro State of Address today, that the mayor talked about license plate readers and the implementation and the purchase of those. So I do think they are on the horizon. They are coming. I don't know when, but it looks like very soon. So I do appreciate what you're saying. I don't think that those are two. I think that those are two different things. But so I do respect what you're saying. I do want Captain Lara at some point to talk about that and then see because whether or not it's a.
I would like to recognize Mr. Milliner first, and then.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Commander Lara after Mr. Milliner.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Great report, a lot of detail in there, Mr. Williamson. I enjoyed it last month, and I enjoyed it this month as well.
Thank you.
Is it basically correct that those comparative departments and cities that are operating under some type of decree have a higher percentage of sustained, if you will, disciplinary actions?
Given that the only point of comparison would be us and Atlanta, yes, those cities do have higher agreement rates than those 2 points of comparison.
Right. And I certainly would agree with members of this committee in saying that I think that a referendum from the people in terms of that issue, talking about preponderance and burden of proof was probably the best thing to do. And I also like, just as I'm putting things here on the record, the idea of an expedited type of review that involves public comment, a specific meeting for public comment. Having said that, and maybe just digging into it just one level deeper, I had a point of clarification when it comes to these competing investigations. If there is an internal investigation that's done by the Office of Professional Accountability, let's say, and let's say it's not criminal, okay? If they rule before we get a chance to review our proposed response, does that render our proposed response moot?
In some respects, yes, and in some respects, no. So if you are with the OPA and you find an officer guilty of allegation A, but not B and not C, let's say, if we then look at allegation A and have a different disciplinary recommendation, that is recommended, that is moot. We can't recommend additional discipline on top of what OPA has already recommended and implemented. However, if we look at allegation D, which OPA did not address at all, we are, regardless of whether they finish before us or not, we are free to make those recommendations, and they are not moot and are certainly fair game.
So is the correct interpretation that if it's lesser, that it's moot? If it's not addressed, it is not?
No, my interpretation would be if it is on the same allegation that OPA has already ruled on, it is moot. If it is on an allegation that MNPD or OPA has not addressed, fair game.
Okay. Of course, the practical application of what I'm talking about is that OPA investigations can be preemptive to our action. Is there any way, what's the recommendation that addresses that balance?
I don't have one on the spot. I think that would be really getting into the weeds of civil service rules, because we are not the appointing authority to make disciplinary decisions, and to change that would be a rather large conversation. And that's not to say that's not happening. That is happening, for instance, I know in Rochester, New York, and it's happening in Portland, Oregon. They're trying to amend their civil service rules, but that's a bigger conversation than this.
Thank you.
Okay,
I wanted to have some clarification too. I just wanted to let you know that when OPA is they're making a recommendation. That's it. They are not actually sanctioning officers. That is left up to the chief of police. So they make their recommendation, they send it to the chief, and it's up to the chief to make the determination, similar to what we do.
And I do want to recognize Commander Laura now, and then Mr. Goddard will be after that.
Good evening. So in regards to the LPRs, at this time, I know that the department is definitely considering the opportunity of utilizing the technology just due to the legislation that was passed. I can't say that it's been decided yet what's going to happen, if we're going to use it or not, but I will say that before anything is utilized, if we do end up utilizing LPRs, there will be policies and procedures in place protect the privacy of those, of our citizens. So it's not going to be something that's just going to go, hey, let's turn on the switch. There's going to be a lot of preparation before, so that we make sure that before we actually utilize it, if that's what the chief decides to do, that there are protections in place for the privacy of our citizens.
I think the concern is, just like with body-worn cameras, that we weren't a part of the policy process when they were being created. And so I'd like you to take that information back to those who are at the table creating policy, because I think what I hear Mr. Goddard saying is that we want to be a part of that process and not just get your policies afterwards and then review them.
Sure.
And make recommendations.
And I will absolutely take that back to the department and make sure that we address those concerns and see what the chief decides to do with that. So, absolutely.
Ms. Goddard.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for talking so much. Two things real quickly. Thank you, Commander Laura. Director Fitcher, not surprisingly, is correct. Both the OPA and we make recommendations, chief decides. The issue that was highlighted from one of the PRRs a few months ago was that on the civil service side, there are timeframes that start. And the chief may be, in some cases has, in some cases may be obligated to make a decision before our process can be completed. And part of the conversation I think is being had, I strongly encourage continue to be had, is with probably again Metro Legal and the Civil Service Commission to find out what the mandatories are for them and to work with them and the chief and find a process that allows civil service deadlines to be met, and this board and staff and board have the time it needs to consider and make recommendations as PRRs. But that's more the issue. The other question I want to raise with you, Mr. Williamson, is the preponderance of the evidence, if you object, Chief Kamek found things different, preponderance of the evidence. That I understand pretty clearly with respect to a fact, if he thinks the evidence preponderates, if that's a word, with respect to the opposite fact. When it comes to whether a set of facts constitutes a violation of police policy, there are going to be different judgment calls there potentially the chief could make, our staff and we could make that might be different. I'm not sure what preponderance of the evidence means if he is disagreeing on the basis of interpretation of a policy. And even if there's an agreement on facts and agreement on the violation of a policy, there could be a disagreement with respect to what of a range of appropriate consequences are. And I'm not sure what preponderance of the evidence favoring a chief's different decision on the appropriate consequence with an agreed set of facts is. If you could tell me what your understanding that means, or whether we need some better definition of that term with respect to those three different, well, don't have to worry about the facts, I understand that, but those other two possible disagreements.
I will punt that question to legal advisor Ewan. I see you nodding your head, so I think you have an opinion.
I knew he was going to do that. So as I understand it, there's the investigative finding, there is the conclusions that we're drawing, and then there's the recommended discipline. Those are the three levels of inquiry. The preponderance of the evidence standard is only being used for the investigative finding and the conclusions. We're not using a preponderance standard for the recommended action. So once we've figured out the first two, then we're moving on to the third, recommended discipline. And if he disagrees with either of the investigative findings or the conclusions, then he can go another way. We are just putting it in writing at first with the clear and convincing standard, which would have been a higher level, a higher burden of proof than preponderance of evidence. But because we're actually saying now, use a preponderance of evidence standard to rebut the preponderance of evidence standard that you're already using, it really doesn't make a difference. But the meaning is there, the significance is there. Saying that we have a presumption of correctness certainly sounds a little bit better than not saying we have a presumption of correctness. But honestly, the standard that he's using currently is, if he's disagreeing with our recommended sentences, it's because we're hoping he's making a different conclusion, he's making a different investigative finding, and by preponderance of the evidence is the standard that he's already using from the Metro codes.
Dr. Hilton.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, I wanted to attempt to practical connect some of this. We have 3 PRRs we're going to look at today. They have a numbering system. So the numbers are, wait a minute, CC 2021-043, 2021-017, and another. So 2021 means that these cases came up in 2021. This is 2022. If employees, and we all have had jobs, we have a right to have our stuff resolved quickly, right? So if there are administrative actions and investigations and decisions on a civil service time frame that came and went in 2021, I think what we heard in this conversation is, if the police have already decided something and we're not getting to it until just now, we're behind the 8 ball. Okay, I talked about taxpayers and your money before. You have a good reason to ask, why are we behind the 8 ball? It's structural and it's systemic. We're almost 4 years old and we spent most of our infancy and toddlerhood being suppressed and unpressed by not having institutional cooperation so we could get this ball rolling. So if we start 2 years behind and we stay 2 years behind, we're always going to be caught in that very good, and it's a fair rule. It's a fair rule. If you get smacked once, you don't get to go back and get smacked again, right? You take that licking one time. But if we're always structurally 2 years behind, what are the systemic reparations that are going to be necessary for us to catch up so that we're doing 2022 work when 2022 things happen, so we can be in a fair race with the police department? I talked about connections. That's why budgets matter. What does this staff need to catch up and keep up so we don't fall behind again? Who's going to pay for the fact that we got put 2 years behind this because of stuff that wasn't our fault, that wasn't the staff's fault? But now how do we do justice? Because there are rules, and the rules are good. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to read in the report, and I think it was important, this, with Atlanta Citizen Review Board, it says the discipline percentage of agreement of sustained complaints for many citizens in the most critical is the most critical factor for how well law enforcement departments are attempting to hold their officers accountable. And I just think that's an important statement, because what we're talking about here is it is very frustrating when we have this staff, they go through all the analysis and they do preponderance of the evidence. And then they give this to the chief of police and it seems like the answers are coming back. I just disagree, but there's no reasoning behind it. So that's something I think with this report we're trying to get around. So at this time, if there's no other discussion, I'd like to ask the next steps, and I don't know if that's Attorney Yoon, that, because I know we have to have the public meeting and everything, so what's the next steps? Because then I'll ask for a motion.
He gave me the last question, and we've talked about it, so I'm gonna let him do this one.
Okay?
So my understanding is that since the
And
executive.
if you can go slowly with that, so we can get it.
Yes. I'm going to explain something first, and then I'll get to a motion.
Thank you.
So my understanding is that currently, based on the executive committee vote in March, this report is currently on an expedited track. That can be amended if people want to take it off that expedited track, but as it currently sits, that's where it is. So what the board needs to do tonight is vote on whether to release this as a public draft. That is not binding to any, these are not board recommendations as a public draft. These are MNCO staff recommendations as a public draft. So what you need to do is you need to take the 4 recommendations and the report as a whole. As I said, you can consider them individually or collectively, and you need to vote on whether these recommendations should be released as public comment. And you can, obviously those, since they can be considered individually, we could be dealing with 4 recommendations, 3, 2, 1, probably not 0, because that's a refusal. So yeah, I believe that's what needs to be done. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, you can entertain a motion that can be properly seconded to either, again, the 2 most popular choices are collectively, the report can be moved as a public draft, or you could do it one at a time or kind of break it up between the 4 recommendations. If we're talking about the straightest distance, then a collective motion would be the preferred option.
Okay, I'd like to recognize Mr. McCree.
If it is in, there we go. If it is in order, Chair, I would like to move that this proposal, all 4 recommendations be released for public draft, so that we can have a meeting for public comment next month.
Is there a second?
I second.
It's been properly moved and seconded by Ms. McCree and seconded by Mr. Whistle. Is there any other focused discussion?
Yeah, I have a question. So does this, I heard multiple board members say that they would like to have a public comment time. So I know that we are talking about this being on the expedited track. If we take it off of the expedited track, then we have a dedicated public comment meeting. Is that what I heard? Okay.
No, there'll be a dedicated public comment either way. If it's on the expedited track, that public forum can be on the same day as our board meeting next month. If it is not on the expedited track, if it's on the regular track, that meeting still occurs, but it has to occur sometime between now and our next board meeting. It cannot be on the same day as the board meeting.
Any other focused discussion? It's been properly moved and seconded that we vote to release as a public draft the 4 recommendations all together. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? No?
No.
Okay, the ayes have it, the motion passes.
So we are on an expedited track where we're going to have a public hearing at the same time we're going to have a meeting. That's just not going to give us any time to consider the public comments, really. But be that as may, if it's passed, it's passed.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is proposed resolution report CC 2021-017. Director Fitchett, you have the floor.
No, ma'am, you can't do that.
Ma'am?
We have
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, so, I was recognizing Director, Pritchard. We're going to the, proposed resolution report. 2021-017.
All right. This is a case CC 2021-017. The complainant waited nearly a year before reporting to MNCO on April 5th, 2021, an incident with the police that occurred on May 9th, 2020. On the incident date, 2 employees with MMPD, officer and sergeant, arrived on the scene after the complainant and another individual called 911. On this incident, the complainant alleged that the other individual pulled a gun on her boyfriend, although the complainant admittedly was not present when it happened. The boyfriend declined to be interviewed, and the alleged assailant was not interviewed due to pending litigation between the parties. The complainant alleged that the MMPD detective, who ultimately was responsible for follow-up investigation, was not doing anything. And the complainant believed that this was purposeful due to the fact that the alleged assaulter was a former Metro police officer. Part of the basis for the complainant's belief was that she had requested multiple times for a copy of the police report, and it had been denied each time. This led the complainant to believe that no police report was actually completed. During the MNCO's investigation, we were given a copy of the police report from that night. We also received specific details about the investigation. And due to the same rules that prohibit disclosure of the police report, we are unable to share the details at this time. Those details are available in the investigative report, and at least one of the board members has been made aware of the confidential details of that report. Based on the preponderance of evidence reviewed, I find that the allegation of obstruction of justice, discourtesy, conduct unbecoming, and deficient performance of duties against all 3 officers is unfounded. And that concludes that 2021-017. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Director Pritchard. Are there any questions or comments on the proposed resolution report? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to either approve the board recommendations, accept, send to MMPD Chief of Police, accept but modify, reject, or return to MNCO staff. Ma'am, you're
Statements are
out
read.
of, ma'am, you're out of order. You're out of order. There will be time for public comment.
Sure.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Milner,
move acceptance of staff recommendation.
is there a second?
A second.
It's been properly moved and second that we approve the board's recommendation for proposed resolution report MNCO CC 2021-17. Is there any further focused discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, let's do a voice vote by name. Mr. Brown? Aye. Ms. Nguyen? Aye. Ms. Spencer? Aye. Mr. Whitzel? Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
The motion passes. MNCO CC 2021-17 passes. That's read. Next on the agenda is proposed resolution report CC 2021-018. Director Pritchard, you have the floor.
Thank you. On April 4th, 2021, the complainant in CC 2021-018 called 911 and reported his vehicle being stolen and being in fear of assault by multiple unnamed persons. When Officer 1 and Officer 2 arrived, the complainant admitted to being under the influence of an intoxicating substance. The complainant further stated that the vehicle may have been stolen in the previous 72-hour period. The complainant was unable to give any additional details or description of the people who assaulted him, nor were officers able to identify anyone in the area who may have been the alleged assailants. Based on the statements of the complainant and the behavior they observed, the officers called for emergency response personnel and an ambulance to medically clear the complainant. When the ambulance arrived, the complainant declined to be examined. Next, the officers attempted to give the complainant time to call a taxi multiple times. Unfortunately, the complainant was unable to obtain a taxi service due to either the taxi cab service not answering or his card being declined. Ultimately, officers 1 and 2 determined that the complainant was publicly intoxicated, and Officer 3 transported the complainant to jail. Officer 3 filled out the report and affidavit that was presented to the judge. And in that report, Officer 3 wrote that the respondent officers offered assistance with calling a taxi. This assistance was declined. Officer 1 and Officer 2 confirmed during their interviews with MNCO that the complainant did try to get a taxi as well as an Uber ride. This was also confirmed by the complainant. During the MNCO interview of Officer 3, he was asked from where he got the information that the complainant declined a taxi. Officer 3 responded, "All my probable calls I would have gotten from Officer 1 and Officer 2. I found by a preponderance of the evidence that the allegations of obstruction of rights, discourtesy, and deficient performance of duties against Officers 1 and 2 are unfounded. I found by a preponderance of the evidence presented that the allegations of obstruction of rights and discourtesy against Officer 3 are unfounded, but the allegation of deficient performance of duties against Officer 3 is sustained. Deficient performance of duties is an offense that varies by severity of the violation, and here I recommend a Category F, which is generally disciplined with formal counseling or a written reprimand for Offense 1. Officer 3 has no prior relevant or similar disciplinary history. I recommend Officer 3 receive formal counseling related to writing affidavits. And that concludes that 2021-018.
Are there any questions or comments for Director Pritchard on CC 2021-018? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the board's recommendations to accept, send to MNPD Chief of Police, accept but modify, reject, or return to MNCO staff.
So moved.
Is there a second? It's been properly moved and second that we approve the board's recommendation for CC 2021-018. Is there any focused discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, we will start by a voice vote. Judge Brown?
Aye.
Mr. Nguyen? Aye. Ms. Spencer? Aye. Mr. Whistle? Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Abstain.
Okay. Thank you. The motion passes. MNCC 2021-018. Now, next on the agenda is proposed resolution MNCO CC 2021-043. Director Pritchard, you have the floor.
CC 2021-043. If you remember, we went over this last month. I'm going to read it over again. We didn't get an opportunity to vote, and so you may recall some of this. It may be familiar to you. CC 2021-043 is a community member initiated complaint where the complaint is alleging 4 violations by the officer who arrested her: obstruction of rights, discourtesy, conduct unbecoming, and discrimination. There's no dispute that an arrest of the complainant occurred on July 24, 2021 by way of a state citation for theft of services. On this date, the complainant was eating at a restaurant with her daughter and granddaughter. During the meal, the complainant's food had a number of issues, including burnt food, overcooked items, and bones in the fish. The complainant reported these issues to her server, and ultimately, because she had not eaten any of her meal, she asked to have it removed from the order, but agreed to pay for the meal that her daughter ordered, ate, and was boxing up. The general manager, during the course of their discussion, allegedly pointed in the complainant's face, talked to her in a rude manner, and ultimately told her, "You are going to pay." Officer 1 responded to the phone calls made by both the restaurant and the complainant. MMPD Manual 4.20.040G states that employees shall be courteous, civil, and respectful to all persons, and shall make every effort to meet the needs of citizens requesting assistance. This is a Category F violation. MMPD Manual 4.20.040D, conduct unbecoming of an employee of the department, states that, number 3, employees shall at all times conduct themselves in a manner which does not bring discredit to themselves, the department, or the city. The offense category varies by severity of the violation. During the roughly hour-and-a-half interaction, Officer 1 is observed via body-worn camera raising his voice, interrupting the complainant, misstating facts, gesturing with his hands in close proximity to the complainant's face, and insulting the complainant by saying she was behaving like a child. This all occurred while the complainant was in a public waiting area of a crowded restaurant in front of her daughter and granddaughter. From the evidence reviewed, I found by a preponderance of the evidence that the violations of the MMPD manual policies of courtesy and conduct unbecoming of an employee of the department are sustained, with the conduct unbecoming violation as a Category F. The allegations for discrimination and obstruction of rights could not be sustained by a preponderance of the evidence reviewed. Prior to court, the district attorney reviewed the case and decided to withdraw and dismiss the citation, but no overt sign of discrimination was observed, and discriminatory intent was specifically denied by Officer 1. Officer 1 has no prior disciplinary history. A first offense Category F is generally disciplined with either a formal counseling or a written reprimand. Here, I recommend formal counseling regarding the statute of the theft of services, investigation, and professional and courteous conduct with the members of the community. And for the conduct unbecoming, I recommend a oral reprimand. And that concludes that case, 2021-043.
Thank you, Dr. Fitchett. Director Fitchett. Is there any questions or comments on this resolution report? Mr. Milner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask staff if this PRR, has there been any modification to it since the last time we saw it?
No.
Okay, so in essence, our recommendation, well, in the case, as we had talked about it earlier, it seemed to be more than just a miscommunication on the part of Officer 1. When Officer number 1 could have done what may be characterized as kind of mischaracterizing what the server said versus what the manager said. There seemed to have been a very clear communication that indicated that the individual who ultimately was cited, actually her position was confirmed by the server that she did not eat even half the meal, let alone the entire meal, and that she actually sent certain portions of it back. My concern here is about accountability and being very forthcoming and straightforward with the community when it comes to policing. And that is that we don't say one thing and write another, okay? So it's my interpretation that it was Officer 1 who basically, when he went to his patrol vehicle and communicated with his sergeant, that he communicated to his sergeant something different than what the server had told him. Is that a fair statement? The server told him that she did not eat the meal, that
Yes.
there were certain things she sent back,
Yes.
but in seeking further guidance from an from a higher authority, the communication was more like she ate the meal, she ate more than half the meal. Now, if I'm interpreting that correctly, I do agree with category F. There's definitely some training that needs to be done. Even at the officer's own admission, in his own testimony, he said that what he would like to have done differently was to wait for backup with someone who knew more about theft of services. Yeah, that's a training issue, but does that address, I don't believe that addressed the mischaracterization of the facts that he or she obtained from the server who had more of a direct experience with the customer than a manager whose word he took in going forward with his recommendation. I don't know where to leave that. I just think that there needs to be some accountability for that beyond just training. I would suggest that, I don't know, Mr. Chair, if it would be appropriate to talk about a specific measure, whether it's oral warning or whatever, but certainly something a little bit more than just training.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? And did you want to talk about it more in detail, Mr. Milner?
I'd like to make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. If there is no other discussion.
I'm sorry, you're right, that would not be in order until further discussion.
Ms. Spencer?
So I think one of the things that has really also been kind of weighing on me within this particular DRR is seeing it from the viewpoint of someone else that was in the restaurants, how this all played out. And also understanding, and from my perspective, how I've also seen particularly Black women being treated, while I do recognize that there is the allegation, I guess, to say of like obstruction of rights and discrimination is unsustained by Director Fisher's report, I do still feel that just the very nature and process and the timeline of the circumstances, and as Mr. Milner is referring to, the mischaracterization that seems to be present with the officer's action does give me pause to consider that there is racial bias in this case. It does give me pause to consider it very strongly. And I think that with whatever the ultimate decision that we as a board make should include that as well. Because from I'm thinking even just personally, just that the very fact that she was not necessarily almost listened to, that the concerns are more so never really truly addressed her, and that she never really seemed to have been represented in a proper manner. And for that, as a civil servant, you have to be able to really stick to how that type of representation. So that is what your duty is as a civil servant. So I also understand that when we often talk about, I hate to use the word punishments, but trying to figure out like forms of accountability in these types of situations where racial bias is present. And especially and correct me if I'm wrong, this is this officer's first offense, correct? Yes, okay. And so it would warrant something that does not necessarily feel as grave, as serious of an offense. But I think this is in line with what Mr. Milner is saying, that we also have to do something very targeted. And from my perspective and from my understanding of the facts around this case, I would also like to see some really intense and really genuine work done when it comes to racial bias, not necessarily specifically like a specific training, but I think to perhaps something even deeper than that. And I think that I would like us as a board to consider that action. And I would like for us to discuss that more in detail as well, so.
I'd like to say something in response to that. I don't think that the reason why we could not, make that as a recommendation, because I don't think that MMPD offers an implicit bias specific training. I do think that they offer they do that mobile diversity and they talk about that. But as for, how they have their own trainings, I'm not really sure that they have a specific training just that targets implicit bias. I mean, that would be a great recommendation that they start having that, but I'm not sure. Do they have, oh, come on, Mr. Commander Lara?
Yes, thank you. We actually do, the whole department, we had a very There we go. Thank you. We did have the Fair and Partial Policing, which is a national program that was given to all of the department, all of our officers, which is dealing with implicit bias, and that was given several years ago. And we actually have updates and in service that we have other trainings that we do as well that has to do with bias. So we have several hours, and I actually just sent some information to Mr. Crowell Williamson about what the bias trainings that we have, and so hopefully you'll be able to get some of that information, but we definitely do have several of it that specifically targets the implicit bias training that you're talking about, so.
Commander Laura, if I
Yes.
may.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you also give us a little bit more of the information around what the latest update has been to that implicit bias training? And I apologize if this is probably like a little bit too more direct of a question, but judging from like even your own understandings of that training and where it currently stands, how do you think that this officer could have done things differently?
Well, I don't want to speak on the officer and what he was going through his mind. I think that'd be difficult for me to say what he could do better because I don't know what exactly he was thinking or what he was going through. So I don't want to speak on that. But I think, again, we do have that training that's available, and we every year officers have a bias training during our in-service. So the training is there. Whether they take the training and use it and learn from it is one thing, but we can definitely say that the department is giving that training to all officers. That helps.
Thank you. I think Mr. Goddard was
Sure.
next. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on, Mr. Goddard. Ms. Spencer, continue.
And right quick, so we all are going to be able to have access to that most recent version of that training, correct? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Now, Mr. Goddard.
I just note that one of the options for category F is formal counseling, and I'm asking perhaps a legal question to Mr. Yoon. Could we recommend formal counseling, including implicit bias training? Something to, I don't know if those are the exact right words, but something to that effect as a part of a formal PRR to the chief?
Absolutely, and we've done that in the past too. We didn't just do one formal counseling training. Sometimes we've recommended 2 or 3. So there's no, I think, ceiling for how much training you can recommend in this situation. Mm-hmm. And I would also note that the second violation for unprofessional conduct unbecoming, it is a variable category. So you have the option of moving it to category E, category D, and you have those different first offense potential disciplinary actions. But again, what you're looking at, just to amend it to more formal counseling, you can keep it at category F. If you wanted to move it from a written reprimand to a 2-day suspension, that would be a category E first offense. That doesn't include any formal counseling, but you could still add it. We use this chart because that's what has been approved by Metro and what the Civil Service Commission has authorized and allowed for, but you are your own body who can make recommendations. We've talked about the path of least resistance. This is the path of least resistance. But there's nothing that you can't recommend that maybe requires a little bit, would prompt a little bit more resistance, and we could advocate for that anyway.
Okay, if there's no other discussion, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve recommendation, and that will be accept, send to MMPD Chief of Police, accept but modify, and I think that's what we're talking about here. Reject, return to MCO staff. And I think Mr. Milliner, you were gonna make a motion.
I would yield to Ms. Spencer, who eloquently made the implicit bias argument.
Thank you. And I would like to accept and modify, I think correctly. Mm-hmm. And I think I would like to accept and modify and have it be including formal counseling, but also for it to be considered category E and have at least a 1-day suspension.
Is there a second? Okay. Okay, Mr. Goddard.
All right, I hope not to have to get into this, but if we're talking about actual suspensions and whatnot, I read the staff report, 15, 20-page, whatever his staff report on this. The investigator concluded that preponderance of the evidence did not establish that the officer was discriminatory, unprofessionally, or racially profiled, and concluded that his actions did not meet the criteria for discrimination, racial profiling, or bias-based policing, but do constitute not having proper knowledge of the law. The recommended improper action there was not having knowledge of the law, making a false claim of theft of services. In light of that, I assume that what has happened is the investigator saw the body-worn camera footage, came to those conclusions. Our director, I assume the quotes are all from the body-worn camera footage that you had, is that right, came there. I am uncomfortable imposing suspensions with that sort of disparity unless I have the opportunity to look at the body-worn camera, which we haven't yet. I don't propose that we all go do that, but that would be my concern in adding a day's suspension. I'm wholly supportive of your motion other than that.
Mr. Milner?
Yes, that's for a point of clarification. Is the prescription or the sanction that we're talking about right now, is that considered a first offense? And we're just referring someone to training? How does that impact the individual's record? I mean, I am concerned about that.
And I will also say, we said, I think earlier, that he didn't have any disciplinary history. He has disciplinary history, but nothing that was relevant, nothing that was a prior, that would count as a prior. I think all of them had to do with miscarriage of government property. So maybe he got into an accident, maybe, something of that sort. So this would be an offense on his record if it was a category F for 24 months that could be used against him for purposes of if he did the same thing. They would obviously be able to escalate this to a second offense or third offense or more.
And I'm sorry, and if it were an oral warning, how does that play out? The same?
Same thing. Any of the categories that are sustained, they will be retained on his record for the appropriate length. So category F is 24 months. A category A would be 60 months, 5 years. It would stay on his, for use for further disciplinary action. Even after the 5 years are over, it's still on his disciplinary history. It's just not going to be counted against him for further disciplinary action.
Thank you.
Ms. McCree?
If in order, I move to accept but modify to a category E with the recommendation of implicit bias training.
Is there a second? Okay.
Well, if you move it to a category E, let's just make sure this is correct, Attorney Yoon, then you have to impose at least a written reprimand as the minimum, is that right? These are yeah. So instead.
But category D does not, right?
Didn't get a second.
Category
Did you say category E?
E requires a written reprimand. D requires a multiple day suspension.
Gotcha.
Can be only 4 counts.
Category F. I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong category.
Okay, so you want the category F, we keep the discipline that I've recommended, and
Yes.
with an added of implicit bias
training.
Gotcha.
There we go. So do I have to resubmit the motion?
Yes.
Or can motion?
It would be helpful, yes.
Yes.
Okay, for the record, I move to use a category F, with the addition of implicit bias training.
I will second that. Oh, my bad, go ahead.
Okay. Was there some discussion there that I missed?
Oh, just point of order. Mr. Chair, how does that differ from the motion that failed?
Okay, it did not get a second.
Yeah, okay, so it failed for lack of a second, and now we're reconsidering the same motion, right?
No, this is a different one.
Okay, all right, that's what I was asking, how do they
Because hers also
differ?
failed because of it did not get a second.
This one had days, okay, this one, okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. All right.
Okay, all right. Okay, it's been properly moved and second that we accept but modify the motion, which was a category F, but with training. It was bias training, okay? And so, all in favor? Wait a minute, is there any focused discussion? Okay?
Well, sorry, Chair. I will accept, and I wanted to say I would second, and I understand the hesitation around the one-day suspension from different colleagues. But it still weighs on me that there is still, that I think the silence kind of spoke a lot for me. And I'm still, to be fair to Member Goddard, you know, for not having, what, you said you saw the body cam footage, correct? I have not. No, you have not. To be fair to all of those concerns, I think, and I understand it is complicated, it is a complicated matter, but I just do not, and again, I also do understand it is still being seen as more of like a first offense or still like a smaller offense, but to me it is I'm very wary of just seeing it as something lightly. And so I understand we all take it very seriously. That's why we're all here doing the work. But there is something just deep in my heart that does give some serious pause. And so so the idea of even of a one-day suspension was not necessarily out of any sort of malice or anything. It was very much that the seriousness and the severity of something like this and how helpless one could feel being in that situation warrants that. But I see that there was no second for my motion, and so I understand that the will of the body is basically was said within the failure of that motion. And so I will accept, I second it, but noting those comments.
Any further discussion? Dr. Hildred?
Thank you. So we are on focused discussion on the current motion.
Yes.
I just need to speak in support of my member Spencer as well. When you first spoke to the deep concern that a Black woman was not listened to, I want to say that I did not second, nor I would not have voted for a one-day of suspension, because that is just, it takes it to another level, that for reasons we have discussed on other matters today, we need to be very meticulous about that. At the same time, I wanted you to know, and I want everybody listening to know, that I felt that, I feel that. This is extremely serious, and we need to give space to that. There's sometimes there's no greater violence than knowing that one's truth gets overwritten by a second superior narrative. So to be able to leave, go call a supervisor, and that recorded narrative to the supervisor says I did something I didn't do, what court do we get to hear that in? I hope the court is, we got to talk about it. You raised it, you flagged it, you slowed us down, you made us listen. And I wanted to say, I hear you. So thank you. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may.
Okay, continue. Ms. Spencer?
So I want to thank you for saying that, Dr. Hildreth. Those words are very much appreciated, and I could feel them, I could hear in your voice just how strongly you meant that. And so I do appreciate that very deeply.
Any other discussion? Okay, it's been properly moved and second that we,
Chair.
sorry. No, go ahead. Judge Brown?
Motion is,
Okay, let's back up again. Okay, it was a category F, but it was modified, except but modified, but we were saying, bias training, implicit bias training. That was the modification, that was the training.
the problem is I'm just having trouble understanding specifically what we're recommending. We're making a category F training, we're recommending counseling and training? That's what I just want to make sure
I think we're basically accepting, what was recommended by Director Fitchard, except we're adding the training.
Okay.
The bias training.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
It is formal counseling, it's just as implicit bias training. That's how it fits the chart.
Okay.
Okay. All right, it's been properly moved and second that we, accept but modify this particular, PRR. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. Okay, the motion passes. Okay, now we're to public comment, but before we get to that, I do want to say that, I might have made a little slight error there because, when we were talking about, 2021-017, it was some confusion going on and that kind of threw me off. But we had talked about actually either a director reading a letter or the complainant reading the letter. But it would be for
Right, the
10
rule says that either
10
you
minutes.
read it or I read it. Or
Yes.
you could, you designate me. The
So
complainant cannot read
I
it.
designate you to read it.
Okay, I appreciate it.
And
But the
then
complainant has an
she will be
opportunity
able to
to
comment.
get, to do a 3-minute
Yes.
regular open public comment.
Yes.
Okay? All right. Excuse me.
And just to clarify, that the rules are, this reading of the letter and the potential response happens after the board hears
Yes,
and votes.
yes,
Right, so under no circumstance
yes,
so we didn't make any error that would have changed the way we vote.
Right.
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
So I received in regards to, case number 2021-017, the complainant sent in, just as is customary, that we ask every complainant to send in a public comment regarding their case. I received that via email. I'm going to read it. It says, Ms. Fitzgerald, for 11 months. Oh, and before I read it, there was names listed in this, and I am going to use instead of using people's name, because that is not how we do our actual work here. So I will use the term witness when you hear that was a name in here, but instead I will use the term witness, all right? So for 11 months, I have been contacting the OC, trying to get a response and report regarding an incident that took place 2 years ago on my property. On May 9th, 2020, witness, an ex-policeman with a troubling pattern of behavior, was once again trespassing on my property, this time trying to remove my survey stakes. Mr. Witness doesn't live next to me, but walks 2 blocks down to my property that is not a part of his subdivision. He has no reason to be on my property. On the day of the incident, Witness was busy trying to remove my survey stakes, and when confronted, an argument ensued, and Witness went for his loaded Glock, and the altercation became physical. This incident was the culmination of many hostile actions Witness has taken against me in his history of harassment, imprisonment, threats, and blocking me in and out of my own property. The final act was an assault with a firearm while trespassing on my property, and yet there have been no consequences for his actions. My specific concern today is the incomplete and otherwise flawed resolution report offered by the OC. This report and other documentation make it clear that the police response to the Witness incident, as well as the following efforts of the OC itself, have been decidedly lackluster. The report has provoked a number of questions and grievances detailed here. First, why did it take 11 months to investigate? Why did you ignore the evidence that I submitted? Were witness statements considered in this process? 2, while the incident happened in the morning, the resolution report keeps mentioning the night of the incident. The pictures, the 911 audio, and CAD report have the times at 9:45 a.m. How can the OCA not get this right after 11 months of investigation? This error in reporting suggests that the relevant materials and documents should be reviewed. Did the OC committee not listen to the 911 audio? I was able to get the 911 audio that the OC has but refused to share with me, but nothing in the report suggests that this information was considered. The evidence was ignored by the police and OC. Who signed off on this investigation report? Where's the evidence that I submitted to detective and MNCO investigator? The gun is evidence, and no mention of this is in your resolution report. The first officer on the scene is clearly shown in photographs to retrieve Witness gun from my property without gloves on. He also removes the bullet out of the chamber. Maybe he thought he wasn't being watched. Does the OC consider these actions to be appropriate conduct? Why wasn't the scene of the altercation protected? Why is Sergeant helping Witness with a civil matter? Why does Sergeant tell the victim that Witness aggression Violence and trespassing do not give him the right to defend himself from witness. Imagine if someone were in your backyard trespassing and a verbal altercation ensued and the trespasser pulled a gun on you, seemingly intent on shooting you. You would defend yourself or be shot on your own property. In our case, the victim was able to wrestle the fully locked Glock from his assailant and tossed it. It was self-defense, and he had every right to defend himself from a man that has a history of terrorizing us and trespassing. Why did the police come to my property instead of witness residence where the 911 operator requested witness to stay and wait for an officer? Why was he not detained at his residence? And why did the police allow witness to come back to my property and walk around with the police on my property, not in handcuffs? Why did this officer give witness back his weapon? Why was witness not in handcuffs? This is a man who told the 911 operator after losing his first gun in an altercation that he was presently headed to procure a second gun. This can be heard in the 911 audio and read in the CAD report. Oversight Committee, I contacted you because I was told that your purpose is to protect the citizens from the police, dirty cops, and investigate their bad behavior. The truth is the OC does not protect its citizens, let alone a single Hispanic woman who has sought recourse from various sources, but felt like I had finally found some help addressing the actions of the cops who have not protected me and have let me live in fear of this man, the witness. None of the evidence or statement witnesses are included in your PRR. I provided the OC with evidence of witness on my property on the phone with 911. Why was this man not arrested? At this point, it seems pretty obvious what is motivating this organization. Shame on you. Nothing that I submitted was addressed in the report. The only truth to be found in the report is the stated reason I contacted the OC, that I believe MMPD officers are protecting the person accused because of his status as a former police officer. I have requested records such as the police report from MPD and have been denied, which I believe is a violation. It's going on 2 years. Why has nothing been done? To make it very clear, I don't agree with the MNOC recommendation. The OC should be held responsible for their inefficiencies in protecting the citizens of Davidson County. The OC is an embarrassment to all. Read the resolution offered by the OC. No action recommended. I sincerely request that this resolution report be re-examined and that my questions and concerns be addressed before this matter is laid to rest. Sincerely, Christine Clark, victim of MMPD/MNOC. That concludes her statement.
Now we'll go with public comments, and I guess, Ms. Clark, you're first. And you have 3 minutes.
Very much. And can I provide you, I would like to provide you these photos.
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Why? Okay, so it's evidence, I'm the citizen and I can't share the
We're
photos?
talking about public comment, ma'am.
Sure. So I believe that your conclusion is unfounded. The evidence was not verified or looked at. Nothing in the report mentions that even talks about the 911 audio. If you listen to the 911 audio, the man is still on my property trespassing while he's talking to the operator. The 911 operator tells him to go back to his home and stay there until the police arrive. He then says that he is going to go back. He has other weapons, including his service weapon. In fact, after the police arrived, one of the officers that picked up the gun had no gloves on, and this would have been evidence because my boyfriend was defending himself and he wrestled the gun from the ex-policeman's hand while on my property trespassing. It is illegal to remove survey stakes, and also, what would you think if you were at your home and you've been harassed by an ex-policeman or anybody at your home? You defended yourself and the cops do not arrest him. They let him go, and the police report there's no police report. After 2 years, there's no police report. So when you try to go to the DA, they're like, where's the police report? So this man has harassed me, has stalked me, and he's still walking around with all of his weapons today. and you just read a report, everyone said aye, and if you looked at the first paragraph where it says on May 9th, 2020, at approximately 9:50 a.m., the complainant called 911. We'll go ahead and go down to number 8. Detective reported that he reviewed both individuals who called 911 that night. It was at 9:45 a.m. How could this be so wrong? In fact, that's not the only error. On page 5, 5th paragraph, they also refer to while arrest was not made of the accused individual for aggravated assault that night, it is not required by police, the law enforcement make an arrest immediately. So there is so many errors in a report that I've waited for 12 months to get, and which Mr. Yoon had filed a motion to quash. I could not get a report. There's nothing been done, and I would like this to be reinvestigated because you do have the evidence. I gave it to the investigator. The detective has the evidence. You can hear it. It's very verifiable. Listen to the 911 audio, please. Please look at the evidence before you just say aye to a brief overview of a report. The evidence is there, but it was not used. So my name is Christine Clark, and I would really greatly appreciate that you reinvestigate these officers and please get this man arrested because he still terrorizes me. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment, ma'am.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else for public comment? Thank you, sir. You have 3 minutes.
Hello again, everyone. I live 1 block from here. I am grateful that y'all are taking this on the road. This is the Community Oversight Board. So y'all got the community part down, and I think it shows by the attendance that showed up in this meeting. So hopefully we'll see you all over Nashville. A couple of comments that I have is listening to the reports that I'm constantly amazed at the desperate mistreatment of some folks that is, I believe, the department's culture is insensitive to it. Listening to the one about the woman at the restaurant, unless you have experienced that, you don't know what that means. For me, there's this weird algorithm that happens. It's a whole bunch of them, then they put their hands on someone else. Then they injure a few others. Then they shoot a few, and then somebody dies. This thing on the bottom, when you're a taxpayer trying to obey the law, and it typically happens to people of color and women, this is serious. The OPA under Kathy Morante, with her known history, that is a part of the public record, it's constantly, you all see it different than the investigations come out. So these are major issues that I believe that you all can really give emphasis and light to. This is not a big deal for the police department to disrespect someone. As I've said before, now I'm 61. It is something totally offensive and disrespectful when a young white officer calls me bro or man. Why does he choose to call me bro or man? And he's younger than my son. That is disrespectful. For those of you who may not understand that, you need to understand the history of a black man who could never outgrow the title of boy, to where me at 61, I'm man or I'm bro. These are the day-to-day issues that impact people's lives, that continue to create that distrust that is there with the police department. Some of your major work is those incidences like that, to where officers must be sensitive to the people that they're confronting, and there has to be only one way for them to respond. They don't get a latitude They should not get let off when an individual feels helpless and then they feel unheard. Nihilism sets in. And when nihilism sets in, people really don't care a lot because they think no one else cares. So again, I just appreciate your work, appreciate all you do. Holding police accountable is not anti-police.
Thank you, Pastor Turner. Is there anyone else public comment? Okay.
Greetings. My
Dr.
name is
Franklin?
Yeah,
3 minutes, Dr. Franklin.
my name is Sekou Franklin. I live at 1921 11th Avenue North. And I want to thank also Board Member Spencer for raising that issue. I'm not sure if a one-day suspension is right or wrong. I'm sorry, it was a right. Not including it was right or wrong. I can't speak to that. But I do at least want to acknowledge Professor Hildreth's comment that those kinds of interactions between police and at the restaurant, they do a lot of damage and trauma. I've been on the other side of that. You go home and it eats at you. You're ashamed that you didn't respond. And terms like child are code words that are similar to boy. Calling people by their first name, African Americans, even though they're over 70 years old. And I just kind of want to acknowledge that kind of pain and trauma. And folks often know what they are hearing, and even if it's not explicit. And I do want to thank the Oversight Board for being a vehicle or venue for allowing for this discussion to happen, and even allowing for the recommendation for implicit bias training. Because there was a time in Nashville where, and it wasn't long ago, where you couldn't even bring these issues up in a public forum. And I'm not talking about so-called white audiences. If you went to some black audiences and talked about your mistreatment by police officers, frankly, some of the black leadership would run you out of the room. They would shame you. They would scold you. They would say, well, it's your fault. You have to get your own self together. And so I'm so grateful that there's at least an opportunity, as Maxine Spencer stated, where you can be visible and not feel so-called afraid or shamed by being visible in your anger and your outrage. So I just want to make sure I point that out.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. Any other public comments? Okay. Thank you all. And now we're down to new business and announcements. Any new business or announcements? Okay,
The only new business, and I forgot to put it in the executive director's report, is that in the July meeting and also the October meeting, those meetings will also be in the public, in the community. And I'll remind you of that going forward. We have July's meeting, October's meeting, because those are also election times. And so our regular place where we have our regular meetings is it won't be available during that time. But hopefully we can get around the entire city, whether or not it's just July and October. If we can do multiple meetings in the community and reach all quadrants of the city, I think it'd be really helpful. And I think our community liaison person will be able to help us facilitate that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. And there was one item I was going to address, but I'm going to defer that until the next meeting. So now we're down to, okay, I didn't see you, Ms. Spencer. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. So Director Fitchard, has the location for our next meeting been decided yet?
In October, in July,
Okay.
Or are you talking about next month's meeting? Our next month's meeting is gonna be at the regular location.
Okay.
But I was thinking in July that we would do, I'd like to do a North Nashville and a South Nashville. So Bordeaux Library is an option, as well as Hartman Park. And then we also have out in Antioch, the Southeast Center or their library, so that we are reaching some people out on the south side of town as well.
I also have a question, and this, I don't know if it is a question that is maybe a little bit too into the minutia for the community liaison's position, but what are their conversations generally like? Because I'm wondering, you know, how often have they walked neighborhoods? Have they like knocked on doors with folks? And perhaps this is potentially a question that just might, I guess I'm unsure of the correct word, but I guess for a lack of a better word, which is probably the wrong word, be a bit redundant given the purpose of the title. Just wondering like what that kind of like community engagement like in the different neighborhoods is looking like.
Well, we haven't we haven't gotten started on that. I mean, the person that we did hire has some extensive background in working in the community, so I was very happy about that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're getting an intern who's actually, even though she's attended Yale University and has lived in New York and New Haven, she has done a lot of ground organizing, and she's gonna help us with that outreach plan. She's actually from Nashville, was born and raised here, so she knows the city and the dynamics, and so I'm excited to have her come on board with us to help us with that communication and outreach plan.
All right, thank you, and again, apologies. You
No
already
problem.
discussed that earlier.
No apologies. Okay, Mr. Milner.
Yeah, just a point of order. I always get confused. For going forward for the next meeting, if I have a question about one of the logs, okay, is that appropriately addressed during the executive director's report or during the policy research report?
Okay, you said a question about, you said
Well,
one.
the complaint log or, you know, the chief's log as far as, you know, his response. At what point, because it's not specifically agendized, I mean, does that come under the executive director's report if I have questions about that? Or does that come under Mr. Williamson's report?
Well, he's not gonna have a report every month, so I think if you have questions about that, that would probably just fall under the executive director's report when we get to the investigations portion, and then at the end, you can ask whatever questions you have.
And I would encourage everyone, if they have questions, if written material sent out and you have concerns about it, go ahead and reply to the email to the director. Because we can't talk to each other individually, but she can, and then she can communicate with the board. So, thank you. All right, and I do want to say again, I am so pleased that we're meeting in this community center. You know, I said that earlier in my chair remarks, but this is really, this is what it's all about. You know, when you think about this whole idea of a board, this is it, that we got the community involved. And yeah, sometimes we're not going to always agree on everything, but pleased to have everyone here today. Thank you for the sacrifice for sitting even 30 minutes over. So now we're to adjournment. I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. Okay, it's a second. The meeting is adjourned. It is 6:32 p.m.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.